Hi everyone, we're back to the Doldrums. We're on the last chapter, sadly. Chapter 17. I'm going to break it up in 2 readings though. Okay? So let's go. Well, that couldn't have gone worse, said Oliver. We nearly died. You nearly died twice. We destroyed the museum and seriously damaged Mrs. Merkley. Despite all of this, there was a general air of gladness to be alive in the back of that taxicab. But Archer knew his current status as a member of the living was only temporary. And while he wasn't certain what awaited him at home, he was certain it was either a hole in the wall or Ravenwood. Adelaide scratched the dry blood on Oliver's blazer. Does it hurt? She asked. Not really, he replied. What exactly happened in the tiger room? Oliver ran his finger across the window. I honestly don't remember, he said. It was difficult to see through those eye holes. I heard... He stopped and turned to Adelaide. Never mind that. What about the crocodile? You've been lying to us for a long time. I had a feeling you were. I guess your mother wasn't eaten either, was she? Asked Archer. No, said Adelaide. She's still very much alive. You were a ballerina? Asked Oliver. Adelaide nodded. What happened with the lamppost? Asked Archer. She didn't want to talk about it, but she did. And while it would be a lie to say this didn't make her sad, she didn't feel as sad as she thought she would. Were you any good? Oliver asked. I was pretty good, she replied. The taxi turned down Willow Street. Archer had a tremendous knot in his stomach. After everything and all their planning, he couldn't even make it out of a museum. He slumped back into his seat, thinking about the iceberg. I hope their best is better than mine, he said. It's my fault, said Oliver. I'm the one who lied to you both, said Adelaide. Maybe not the tigers, said Archer, but the rest was my fault. We did this together, said Adelaide. After that, no one said anything. What followed when they arrived at Helmsley House was now only a blurry memory. They were slow crawling out of the back seat and slower still walking up the front steps. They paused at the doorknob and after a communal nod, pushed open the door inside. Inside there were lots of adults shouting lots of things, and while it was a lot to take in, compared with the tigers, they didn't think it was so bad. Does this sort of thing happen often here? Asked Mr. Belmont. Not that I know of, chuckled Mr. Glubb. I don't think many people can say they outran a pack of tigers. I never did, said Mr. Helmsley. Listen to them, shrieked Mrs. Helmsley. They've all got one foot off the merry-go-round. It's good to stretch the foot from time to time, said Mr. Glubb. Tea, said Mrs. Glubb. I think we all need tea. Lots of tea. Or espresso, said Mr. Belmont. You could have died, cried Mrs. Helmsley. But we didn't, said Archer. It just happened, said Oliver. We did good, said Adelaide. 2 weeks had passed since that nightmare of nightmares, and it now seemed like an impossible dream. Archer went to the cellar, emptied a scarlet trunk, and carried it back to his room to pack his things. The train for Ravenwood left in 3 days. Mr. Helmsley stepped into the room just as he was finishing. He had dark circles under his eyes. The phones at Helmsley and Derbysh had been ringing non-stop since the tiger incident, and most days a line of people waited to file lawsuits against the Rosewood Zoo wrapped around the office. The head of the zoo had been fired, and they were currently undergoing major changes. Mr. Helmsley sat down on the bed, and Archer decided to tell his father everything he had discovered. There was no reason for him to keep it a secret any more. I know Grandma and Grandpa were living in Barrows Bay, he said, and I know Mom sent them away after I was born because she didn't want them around me. His father didn't bother asking how he discovered any of this, but there are a few corrections to make. They were living in Barrows Bay, he replied, but your mother didn't send them anywhere. She couldn't. We didn't live in this house before you were born. Archer glanced over the lid of his trunk. Why do we live here now? He asked. Your grandparents wanted us to move in after you were born. They wanted you to grow up in this house. Your grandfather had big ideas for you, said Mr. Helmsley, and he paused. Your grandparents are very good people, but they're part of a strange world, a world filled with many peculiar people, people that make your grandparents seem commonplace. The society, you mean? Mr. Helmsley rubbed his chin and raised an eyebrow. The society, he repeated. I trust you haven't been there. No, said Archer. Yes, well, the society is a big part of it. But also your mother and I agreed that we wanted to be the ones to raise you, not your grandparents. So we said no. But we did move in, said Archer. Yes, your grandfather is a very persuasive man, Mr. Helmsley replied, and folded his arms. After we declined the first offer, he quickly made a second. What was it? Archer asked. He promised they would stay away until your 12th birthday if we would take the house. It took him some time to persuade your mother, but she eventually agreed, and in we moved. Of course, no one had any idea they were going to wander onto an iceberg before your 12th birthday, Mr. Helmsley smiled. But that's very much your grandparents. And while they might be a little reckless, they knew exactly what they were doing getting you into Helmsley House. They didn't have to be here. Their magic is in these walls. They knew the house would raise you. Your mother realized this as well when she overheard you speaking to the animals. That's why she wanted you at all those dinner parties. She wanted you to start speaking to humans. Only you were never good at that, were you? Archer grinned, though he tried not to. Mr. Helmsley's eyes suddenly twinkled. But you did meet your grandfather. And you know you did. At the dinner party, said Archer, nodding. How do you know about that? He wanted to get a good look at you. I snuck him inside for a quick visit. Archer sat atop his trunk and stared glumly at his father. I still don't understand why we couldn't have shared the house with them, he said. Right or wrong, that's what we decided. Like I said, it was our job to raise you, not theirs. And had we shared the house, many of their strange associates would have been coming and going. Your mother and I both agreed you shouldn't grow up around all of that. But you did, said Archer. And didn't you miss seeing them? Well, you've actually spent more time in Helmsley House than I ever did. I was only here and only saw them on summer breaks and holidays. They sent me to boarding school. They wouldn't do that, said Archer. They did, his father replied. They were traveling much more back then, and I was too young. They thought I would be better off at boarding school, and it was for the best. How could it have been, said Archer. What about all your museum stories? You never did what you wanted to do. That's not true, his father replied. I loved hearing about my parents' adventures, but going on one myself, that's never been my interest. The museum was your grandfather's idea. After he met you, he made me promise to start taking you to the museum and tell you stories, which I was glad to do. But the stories I told you were never my own, and they were never any good, were they? Well, they weren't terrible, said Archer. Mr. Helmsley grinned and pointed a finger in the air. World's greatest explorer. That's pretty terrible. Your grandfather must have known they would be pathetic at best. I assume that's why they started sending you those boxes, but he must have forgotten to mention he'd be doing that. I take great pride in being their son, Archer, but I also take great pride in being the only boy in the history of the world who disappointed his parents by becoming a lawyer. I'm certain that's another reason your grandfather wanted you in Helmsley House. Just think how embarrassing it would be if both his son and grandson became lawyers. Archer's smile quickly faded. And now I have to leave, he said. I'm afraid so, his father replied. But try not to look so miserable about it. A little country air can do wonders. You've been cooped up in this house for far too long. And besides, despite my best arguments in your favor, the Willow Academy hasn't decided whether to allow you back just yet. Mr. Helmsley stood up, trying not to laugh. I can't quite figure it out, he said, but something about this whole tiger incident is not sitting well with me. And while it never should have happened in the first place, between you and me, I really thought you handled it very well. Thanks, said Archer. His father was about to leave the room, but Archer had one final question. Do you think they're still alive? Mr. Helmsley was silent a few moments, and when he spoke, he kept his back turned. They had a good sense of humor about such things, and so must we. But what I think doesn't matter, Archer. If you believe that they are alive, it's important that you go on believing so. We will end there. See you tomorrow.